Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this complimentary webinar to hear from one of our faculty members at the London Business School who teaches on our Accelerated Development Programme, and we'll be talking today on conflict resolution in teams. Professor Randall Peterson will be talking shortly, and I would ask that we have any questions, perhaps at the end of the session. We'll be tracking your questions, so please do use the chat system, and we will endeavour to answer as many of those as possible during our session today. Professor Randall Peterson is Subject Area Chair of Organisational Behaviour and former Deputy Dean of Faculty. His most current research activities include Sinking Slowly, Diversity in Propensity to Trust Predicts Downward Trust Spirals in Small Groups, Strategies for Developing Trust Through Constructive Conflict Resolution in Teams, Strategies for Developing Trust in Teams, and he is also currently working to set up a Leadership Research Institute at the school. In addition to his academic interests, Professor Peterson has been invited to teach and consult across the world for companies as diverse as Alcan, Barclays, Chevron Texaco, Deutsche Bank, Emirates Bank, IBM, Lufthansa, Nestlé, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Roche. Randall is a recipient of the London Business School's prestigious Excellence in Teaching Award and teaches on our flagship executive programmes, the Senior Executive Programme, as well as the Accelerated Development Programme, and on the London Business School's MBA programme and High Performance People Skills. Details of these courses and Professor Peterson's other publications are, of course, available on our website, and contact details with more information will be posted at the end of this webinar. I shall now hand over to Professor Randall Peterson. Thank you.
Thank you, Ginny. As Ginny said, my name is Randall Peterson, and I'm a professor here, and I'm going to be talking about conflict resolution in teams. And conflict is one of those things that we all seem to have experienced at some point along the way. We all think we know about it. We think we know how to deal with it sometimes. And some of what I will say, you will think to yourself, I knew that. Other things I will say might challenge the way you think about conflict. But everything I say is actually evidence-based. It's based on research on real teams working on real problems over time. So please keep that in mind. And as we go through, Ginny may ask a question, but I would say most questions we'd like at the end. So let me start by just making sure we all understand what is meant by a team. So a team is a small group of people. So we think typically fewer than 20 with complementary skills. So it's meant to be, we all work together. We bring together diverse perspectives, ideas, backgrounds to improve the team's performance. So we should have a common purpose and a set of performance goals. Of course, that's not always, that's the ideal. Sometimes people think of teams more like this. A camel is a horse put together by a committee. So how well do teams manage conflict? Well, we typically or oftentimes think, well, not very well. We think about groupthink, which is this kind of overwhelming drive for consensus. And so in the process, we compromise too much. We create the lowest common denominator. We agree things we don't really believe in, and all kinds of problems. And indeed, one of the most eminent psychologists in history, Carl Jung, suggested when 100 clever heads join a group, you get one big nincompoop. And indeed, that's one of the reasons I started studying teams and conflict, because I couldn't understand how groups of really great people can come together and actually make silly decisions. And most of it revolved around how they managed conflict, or in many cases, how they didn't manage conflict. So That being said, it turns out if you actually look carefully at how groups work, groups do produce more and higher quality solutions than individuals. If you actually look across time, across country, different tasks, for the most part, teams actually are a good way of doing business. That's why they're standard practice across the world. Presidents and prime ministers have a group of advisors who help them. Chief executives have a top management team, and so on throughout the world. Of course, that advantage doesn't come for free. There are oftentimes trade-offs in terms of the total number of hours dedicated to it. And sometimes we don't always get the best of everyone, and the best individual may not benefit by being a part of the team. The team may reach up to the level of the best individual. And so sometimes people might even say, maybe we should just put that expert in charge. Now, one of the reasons we don't, if you think about why teams are used, sometimes it is about information exchange, and sometimes it's also about getting everybody on board. Both of those are important in terms of conflict management and conflict resolution. Both purposes are helpful. So it's a classic trade-off, more time for a team, but you're likely to benefit from it. So the things that are really important, you should be doing in a team and have to deal with conflict, and less important things, perhaps you can delegate to an expert. So what do I mean by conflict? So there's a very simple definition and a pretty good one here. A serious incompatibility between two or more opinions, principles, or interests. Okay, so fairly straightforward. One of the things, I guess the first thing to think about though, we oftentimes think about conflict as a bad thing. So if you look at what I've got here, 10% of conflict is due to difference in opinion, 90% to the wrong tone of voice. Somehow, when we're in conflict, we waste a lot of time and energy. Or we fight not because we truly disagree, but rather because we fail to understand one another, that we waste a lot of time engaged in conflict that's probably unnecessary. On the other hand, for those of us who study conflict, we understand that nothing worthwhile gets done without conflict. That all of the great things that happen in the world are usually, a product of some process where conflict was involved. So it's always conflict isn't a universally good or bad, it's a means to an end. If we get it right, it can be hugely positive. Great things can happen. If we get it wrong, it wastes our time, it wastes our energy, and saps us of our energy to get things done. So if you think about it at the organizational level, conflict in organizations typically looks something like this, where there are lots of inputs, lots of people in the organization pulling in different directions. It kind of sort of migrates to the right here, and in the end you get some outcomes, but the outcomes typically are a bit diverse and a bit dispersed. What you would like to have, if you can manage these conflicts better, is something that looks a bit more like this, where the organization doesn't spend all of its time working against each other and the teams within it, and the individuals or the individuals within the team are all working, we hope, in the same direction. So let's talk about conflict. Let's talk a little bit more about how to understand it and how to perhaps then deal with it, manage it, resolve it. First thing is I need to talk about is that not all conflict is the same. There are some different types. So the first type of conflict is relationship conflict. Disagreement amongst members about interpersonal issues, such as personality differences, differences in norms and values. And I'll talk about each of these in more detail. I'll just briefly introduce them here. Second one is task conflict. So disagreement about the content or outcome of what's being discussed, separate from the relationships amongst us all. And third, process conflict. Disagreement about the logistics of a task conflict, about the assignment of responsibility, such as delegation of tasks and responsibilities. So let's dive in just a little bit deeper here on each one of these. First, relationship conflict. So relationship conflict, again, about disagreement, it's about interpersonal animosity. I hate you type of conflict. I dislike you. I don't want to be with you. Many people call this emotional conflict. And I think it's a bit of a misnomer because it does, although it does involve emotion, pretty much all types of conflict involve emotion. And in particular, it turns out process conflict produces the most in most groups. It's about the sharing of responsibilities between members in the team that creates at least as much emotion as the negative affect between individual members. So, what are the outcomes of relationship conflict in groups? Primarily poor decision making, dissatisfaction with the process and the outcome, distraction from your work. It pretty much is across the board a bad thing. Something that, in terms of your optimal pattern, you would like to avoid. So, what is the best strategy for dealing with this? Well, it's about learning to understand and appreciate differences, developing some feedback skills, really trying to understand perhaps what the values are of the other person, understand why they may be arguing for something perhaps different from you. It is an extremely difficult form of conflict to deal with, and it is very strongly correlated with poor performance in teams. So it is really the poison pill of any group. You'll want to avoid it if you can, although it's not possible sometimes. So obviously, we know it happens. Next is task conflict. So it's a disagreement about the content of decision, difference in viewpoints, opinions about the work in front of us. Now, it turns out it is oftentimes encourages divergent thinking and creativity. Not always. It's not a guarantee. In fact, sometimes task conflict can be highly correlated with relationship conflict, and it looks something like this. I have a disagreement with the same person over and over, mainly because we see the world in a different way. And what starts off with, I disagree with you about how to engage this task, turns into, well, why does he keep disagreeing with me? Does he keep disagreeing with me because he hates me? Because he doesn't like me? So you get task conflict turning into relationship conflict. So your optimal pattern is actually to have some, not too much. If it gets too much, it will tend to spill over into relationship conflict. And in terms of resolution or how to approach it, when you see task conflict in front of you, perspective taking, why is that person saying that? Listening, learning what they're saying, and importantly, in the little tag I've got on the right side there, the goal of resolving conflict in this kind of relationship is not victory or defeat. It's about understanding, letting go of the need to be right. Typically, that will help you. That kind of idea that it isn't about you winning, it's about making the best decision and getting the best content and outcome in a team, if you can. Third, process conflict. A disagreement again about task accomplishment, delegation of task, and so on. Two types broadly. First is logistics. How do we accomplish our work? How much time do we spend together? How much time do we allocate to various tasks, and so on? And the one that gets most people really emotional and angry at is relative contribution and workload. Who does more work than the other? And what happens then as a result of that? And we find that one is actually the most kind of evocative for people in teams, the one that makes people most upset. So what is the outcome? Well, like task conflict, it has a plus side and a negative side. It can become dysfunctional if it misdirects focus and distracts from the task. However, it can also be good if you discuss things early and first. Talk about process issues early tends to help. So it can lead to performance declines and dissatisfaction if you're not careful. So you want moderate levels of process conflict, and you want it to decrease over time. If at the end of the meeting you're discussing how the decision will get made, you're probably not really discussing about process. You're probably really discussing about I'm about to lose this decision and I don't want to lose, which is not helpful. So discuss early how decisions will be taken and discuss the content later. Now, one of the other things that's important to understand about conflict is where it comes from. Because in addition to what type of conflict, knowing where it comes from will also help you pull it apart and deal with it. So first, differences in information or experience. This is where integrative solutions are possible, where everyone can win if we all know what the other knows. So learning is the key issue here. People need to learn from each other if you're dealing with a difference in information, experience, and so on. However, it may be different interests. So what is good for me is not good for you. I win, you lose. This results in trade-off and negotiation. Every player needs to give something. Every player needs to give up something. And what you'll want to do here, classic negotiation, is trade off the things that are more valued by me, that I get to keep, and give away the things that are less valuable to me, more valuable to the other party. And third, variance in values, motives, personalities. This is the deep level stuff. This is the stuff where, for example, in values, they're oftentimes called backstop values because you can't really explain them. If you keep asking people why, so why do you value something? Oh, and then why does that? So I value people getting along with each other. Well, why is that? Well, because I like to make sure that things go smoothly. Oh, well, then why is that? Well, I value good relationships, peace and harmony between people. Well, why is that? And you get to a point where you can't explain it. It just is who you are. It's what you value. The problem with values and motives is that you're generally unwilling to compromise them. So whereas when it comes to interests, you'll take something and get something else. Information, it's about learning from each other. When it comes to values, you're unwilling to compromise. And that makes conflict management and resolution extremely difficult. Okay? And I'll talk about a little bit more about then, even in that situation, how to deal with that. But first, here's an example, one that when in my introduction, Ginny alluded to here, which is how diversity leads to conflict and poor performance in teams. So in this particular paper that I just did, working with real teams over a 3-month period, diversity and propensity to trust, which is you walk into the room, do you say, most people are trustworthy, I think, I'm going to just open up here and share. Versus you walk into the room and you say, there's a lot of people here, many people are not trustworthy, I'm going to be cautious. I will trust, but only if I build up to it and only if I see trustworthy behavior. So difference on that, which is a personality dimension, tends to create these affective consequences. In this case, people feel really different from each other. So the guy across the table from me is unloading all kinds of information and thoughts and perspectives. And I'm thinking, why is he doing this? Is he just completely naive, or is he trying to manipulate me? Vice versa, I come into the room, I'm not sharing much because I'm waiting to see if people are trustworthy. The person across the table is thinking, why isn't he being helpful with his team? So those feelings of difference then lead to not great initial trust within the team, so relatively low trust. That leads to further decline, relationship conflict. I actually think because I'm really different from you, I start to dislike you, which leads to further decline in trust and poor performance in a group. So it's a bit of a depressing story that most groups can't manage conflict and diversity and perspective on something like personality or values. And this is an extreme example because it's the most difficult example for us to work with. But there are ways of dealing with this, okay? And that's what I want to talk about now. So So first, oh, sorry, I should have said first, I want to just point out that most people think of diversity along these lines, where you get diverse perspectives that helps you in terms of information, but it can also result in problems with what's called social categorization. So, which is, I don't like this person because they're an example of X, the kind of person, they're a member of this different political party, they're a member of this group I don't like. And although that perspective may be useful in developing an opinion or a group decision, it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, I could benefit from it. On the other hand, I don't like it. Most people think of managing diversity in that way. And in fact, most people also, in most groups, performance and diversity are actually unrelated. So the more diverse perspectives you have around the table, it doesn't help you. And the reason for this is at the bottom of the slide. Diversity can cause problems when it results in factions, coalitions, misunderstandings, and so on. So although we usually think of diversity being a really potentially helpful thing, it also gets in the way. And that's back to this notion of it cuts both ways. It's a double-edged sword. It's good because it gives us more information. It's bad because it makes us not get along with each other. However, dig in a little deeper, what we actually find is this. So instead of a line, the perspectives actually start to diverge. So more diverse teams produce more diverse outcomes. And this is actually a really important bit of information to know. So the best team in the distribution here, the one who's most effective is this one, right? That's your best performance, highly diverse. The worst performance in the distribution, right there, also highly diverse. That's actually what the data show us. And what this means is that how you manage this problem is key and central to being effective. So how do we extract best from diversity of information, experience, interests, motives, personality, all that stuff in a team? Well, there are three key things I want to draw your attention to. First is the absolute central role of trust. Trust is the key variable to assess. When you have trust, people can disagree about tasks and it doesn't turn personal. And if you don't have trust, people always interpret things in the worst possible light. They look at behavior and they say, I don't trust that, I don't like that, I don't agree with that. So if you can have trust, this is the gold dust of any team. Unfortunately, it doesn't just manufacture itself. It can be very difficult to actually achieve. If you've got it, value it, protect it always, because that is actually going to make your ability to deal with conflict much easier. Second thing to keep in mind, or second key concept for managing conflict, and that is coordination. Teams with diverse information, perspectives, and values are likely to experience coordination failure early on. And when I say coordination failure, it's your inability to integrate all that information, and it's not emotional. It's just that I'm talking in inches and feet, and you're hearing centimeters and meters. We think we're talking about the same language. We may even be in the same organization, but the way that the marketing division talks about a particular topic and may even use some of the same words is completely different from operations. And we think we're kind of talking about the same thing, and it turns out we're not. Teams are notoriously good at dividing up work and notoriously bad at reintegrating and coordination. There's a very long stream of research showing this, that the teams tend not to be very good at putting those pieces back together. Great at pulling them apart, struggle at putting them back together. So the challenge here is, how do I ensure coordination and look for coordination problems early? Because what tends to happen is once a coordination problem occurs, team members tend very quickly to go to the explanation of looking for people who are different. So why did this not work? Why are we having problems? Not because simply we come from different worlds, that actually that person looks different, that person has different values from me, and it's obviously her fault or his fault it's not working. So try to avoid the fault finding and then focus more on how we work together and ensure that this coordination failure doesn't happen again. Third thing I want to talk about, a key concept in managing conflict, is decision-making options. So when trying to make decisions, perhaps where conflict is high and trust is low, you have three options. One is qualified consensus. So everybody can live with the decision. They may not think it's the best one, but they can live with it. A second option is you discuss it and then team leader decide. The advantage to this is that it doesn't disenfranchise or disconnect one single subgroup who perhaps didn't like this. And the reason is because they still want to maintain a relationship between the leader and the individuals. And so that is a reasonable way of going about it. What you should actually actively avoid is majority rule, some form of voting. Most people think that works, that's great, it's a form of democracy, it's, and so on. It turns out it's associated with really angry people, disenfranchised or disconnected subgroups, and really poor performance. So they're in the order you would expect, or you in terms of performance here. Trust is best. We went back to that, but qualified consensus, leader decide, third, majority rule. And here is a bit of a complicated slide. I apologize for that. It actually comes from one of the papers I've done recently, which is about conflict resolution in teams. And what we're looking at here is how well do teams balance their performance as a team against satisfaction. Do I enjoy being a part of this team? Do I feel good about being a part of this team? Best teams were both, if you look on the left-hand side, pluralistic. By that I mean they had strategies that applied to everyone in the group, versus particularistic, meaning a decision or a rule to confine a single individual. So you have a really difficult individual in your team, and you make a rule which says this person can't do that, or officially everybody can't do that, but it's really directed at one individual, because they're likely to see it as a kind of individual attack, again, that people withdraw. On the bottom, you have preemptive strategies. We think preemptively about what kind of conflict might we experience, versus reactive. We're experiencing a problem. How do we deal with it? And the teams that are best are those that both preemptive, they're thinking forward, and they're also thinking about what are the issues, how are we all gonna work together to solve those problems, and we think about them before they get out of control. The teams that were least happy and poor performers were those that just reacted to problems as they emerged and said, all right, well, we'll try that. Oh, that didn't work. We'll try that. That didn't work. And they're very focused on, specific individuals or subgroups within the team. But the other thing you can see here is that if performance is the most important thing, overall strategies are best. If satisfaction is the most important thing, talk about conflict before it emerges, because you can at least get that kind of satisfaction and engagement in the team. Most people will want to have performance, and so you'll also ideally want to have preemptive strategies that are focused on everyone in the team. Now, I realized some of you may want to know more. So I've also included in the slides, which we can make available, additional reading. And there's a range of things there, from books to book chapters to academic articles, depending upon how engaged you want to get with this and how much you actually want, how much detail you'd actually like. Okay, so with that, I think we'll be opening up for questions.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Randall. So please do let us have your questions. I can see a couple of people typing now. If you could please let us know your questions. In the meantime, I'm interested to hear a little bit about the language, the topic of language and how that plays in conflict. So Randall, you mentioned earlier that a lot of organisations have perhaps quite a closed language. In other words, they're using words or acronyms that they are familiar with and used collectively as a team, but sometimes it's very difficult for the outsider to understand that, and therefore that can sometimes cause conflict. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit more about that from your research?
Sure. The primary issue there tends to be in this problem of coordination. So we think we're talking about the same thing, and it turns out we are not talking about the same thing. And the way to deal with that is, first of all, to understand that it will happen, to accept that, and to focus on that as the first port of call for explanation when your team struggles. So rather than going to perhaps blaming individuals or perhaps looking for an outside explanation, to look, or somebody doing something wrong, look for neither party did anything wrong, and we're simply misunderstanding each other even as we're speaking to each other when we think maybe we understand, but we don't. So look for that as a key explanation, especially where it comes to acronyms and very specific use of terms.
Thank you. Another question we've had is how to handle difficult personalities in teams.
Okay, a great question. Well, this is where, if we think about that last rather complicated slide, you need to preemptively, as much as possible, think forward to the kind of problems that they can and do create within the team, and create some rules of engagement for the whole team, not focused on just the one individual, that will help deal with whatever difficult problems they're creating for the team. Of course, the other strategy or additional strategy you can use, and this may depend on the individual and what the difficulty is, but oftentimes people are difficult because they feel they're not being heard. And so this is the critical point of going back, listening, trying, even if you think they're likely to be wrong about some key issue, but at least try to understand what the backdrop to that is. What information do they have? What are their values? And be able to identify whether their concern is values, interests, or perhaps information that other people aren't listening to. So I would say both could go about, both be central to a strategy for dealing with difficult personalities, both at the individual, trying to understand, and also at the team level, preemptively decide what problems they are creating and create solutions that appeal to everyone in the team.
That's very helpful. Another question that we've had is in relation to conflict, where conflict continues. So once you've spent some time to do the listening and the understanding, and you've tried to put in as many efforts as possible into it, what's the next strategy when it's not working, when the listening and the understanding is not working?
Well, I can answer this at two levels. One level has to do with how to deal with the relationship between two individuals, and the other has to do what to do at the team level. So I'll start with the team level. At the team level, if there's a relationship conflict between two individuals within the team, the team leader needs to very clearly differentiate between what we're talking about as a group and the specific relationship between the two individuals. So try to put any bickering or problems between two individuals to a side and take it out of the group equation as best as possible. And separately then, if you want to deal with the relationship between the two, if all that perspective taking, trying to understand those values doesn't really work, and it really is just fundamental dislike between two people. What I can tell you, based on research, is that every relationship has embedded in it a serial argument. And that serial argument is the argument based in values that never goes away. So we talk about it over and over and over, and we simply cannot resolve it because we have different values. If it is of that nature, it's probably not resolvable per se. You're never going to like them. So, best advice, both parties implicitly agree to not discuss it ever again. Okay, because the way it works is you have the argument repeatedly and you never resolve it, and both parties get hurt by it. So the best thing to do is literally to essentially each stand in your own corner and try not to come headlong into each other. And that doesn't necessarily mean you can't cooperate on a lot of things. You can still cooperate, but you need to be very careful about dealing with that specific problem. You may have to literally put it behind a glass wall, certainly in the group context.
Lovely, thank you. So we've talked there, we've had a number of questions around when the conflict is continuing and how to resolve that. We have a question here about how to, or do you have a framework or a strategy for building early team trust?
Yes, thank you. That is a great question and one that comes up quite often. Trust is typically built through, maybe ironically, early conflict resolution in the team. If you can have small conflicts, small disagreements, you collaborate, you work through them, you build trust, that even as the next one comes along and the next one comes along that are bigger and bigger, that you can actually continue to develop trust with the team. What to be careful of, there are a lot of consultants out there selling you services of learning, for example, how to trust in a completely different environment. The problem with that is, even if I build trust, say, in a physical environment, it doesn't necessarily translate into the work environment with the two, with us all working together in the office in a team. So just be a little bit careful that you don't end up with a strategy that has to do with different contexts, because teams don't transfer very well. So again, but what you can do is pick very specific conflicts, small ones to start, and work your way up, gradually reducing tensions or gradually building trust through experienced interaction where you successfully resolve conflicts and disagreements.
Thank you very much, Randall. So I think that's all that we have time for questions. I do hope you've enjoyed listening to this webinar. We have a number of pieces of information on this final slide. The Accelerated Development Programme, we have some upcoming dates listed here. So we have a programme coming up at the end of November. The places are filling up very quickly. However, we do have a handful left. So if you would be interested, please do contact us. And we also have another webinar on the 20th of October, where I will be providing you with some information around the Accelerated Development Programme from a Programme Director perspective. And so I will be able to help you with any queries or questions that you may have. And if you would like to learn a little bit more about the format of the programme, the content and the activities that we cover. So please do feel free to register for that webinar. I would love to hear from you, and you can see the contact details that we have at the bottom. So I'm Ginny Naylor, Programme Director, signing out from this webinar for today. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for participating and for all your questions. Thank you.